Officials in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv say Russian missile strikes have injured several people. The strikes hit a fuel storage facility on the outskirts of the city, which immediately caught fire. Authorities say the city's infrastructure was damaged by the strikes, but no residential buildings were struck. Now, Lviv is located around 70 kilometers from the Polish border and has been seen as something of a safe haven for those fleeing the Russian invasion from other parts of Ukraine. I want to get straight across to DW's correspondent, Fanny Fachar. She's been reporting for us from Lviv. Fanny, tell us where you are and what's been happening.
I'm in the city center of Lviv, the biggest city of western Ukraine, and I remember during midday we heard explosions. Apparently that fuel that we've seen in the pictures, in the video, stems from a facility that was storing fuel, while according to the Lviv mayor, another rocket hit a few hours later, which apparently hit infrastructure but not residential buildings, as we hear. However, that third explosion we did not hear. We were already sheltering also ourselves in a bunker where we are actually headed in next as well, because fresh air raid sirens just started. So as a result, everyone who is out on the street at this point, and a curfew is about to start in an hour as well, need to go down and hunker down. It is going to be a quite restless night here for the citizens of Lviv.
And tell us, if you can, a little bit more about what it is like in that bunker. You've been in and out, as we've been reporting throughout the evening. Are people taking these air sirens seriously to go down there?
Depends really where you are. We have been traveling across many parts of Ukraine. Here in Lviv, really a relatively safe city. People, when they hear the air raid sirens or heard them before, some of them were more or less getting to the next coffee shop and getting their next latte macchiato, while others, especially elderly people, were looking for shelter. Also, a church just right in front of me here, there's still light in there. Some people are looking for shelter in a church. Very different reactions. But today, really, there is a change, because so far, even though there was a facility near the airport hit on March 18th, which is about 7 kilometers from here, but never so far, at least, into the war, so close to the city center, several rockets hit Lviv. So people themselves are bracing for possibly more, and are wondering if this is somehow anyhow connected to the fact that US President Biden is in Poland, which is, by the way, just about 60 kilometers from here, from Lviv.
And indeed, Lviv has been a haven for many people fleeing other parts of Ukraine to go to the relative safety of the West. What do you think these attacks do mean for a potential escalation of the conflict?
That's a really good question, because if you listened into what Russian authorities had to say about the so-called second phase of the war, that they actually just want to focus on the Donbas region and not on any major cities anymore, not knowing whether, of course, this is just propaganda or what that's supposed to mean. People really thought that in Lviv they are safe. Hundreds of thousands of people are stranded here because they didn't want to leave Ukraine yet. They thought that this is a safe place to stay before they can actually go back to their home cities, hoping that the war is going to be over maybe in a few weeks, in a few months from now. But also millions of others have left Ukraine already. About 1/4 of the Ukrainian population is displaced. So yeah, that's a feeling, or that status quo maybe that some people felt Lviv has as a safe place is definitely changing, because the war, the strategy of the war and those who fight it is changing as well.
Fanny Fachar for us in Lviv in Ukraine. Thank you so much for your reporting. Please stay safe. Well, Ukraine has now seen a month of fighting that has left thousands dead and forced more than 10 million people to flee their homes. Now, Moscow has said it's shifting its focus to Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. While the Kremlin claims it has largely successfully completed the first phase of what it calls its military operation, some analysts say it could be a sign Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to save face after failing to subdue Ukraine or capture its capital, Kyiv. But as Moscow changes focus, the human suffering from its invasion shows no sign of abating.
Signs of spring greeted Kyiv on Saturday as Ukraine shakes off its winter and enters a new phase of war. There may be a change in strategy after Russian defeats, but there's little respite for those on the front lines of battle. Many are visibly exhausted but steadfast in their determination to stay. Putin came, as you can see, he says. Our children and grandchildren are dying. I'm 62. I can't leave this place. I'll stay here. If need be, I will die here. But I will not give them Ukraine. Ukrainian forces have recaptured areas on the outskirts of the capital, Kyiv. Still, lives continue to be destroyed. At this hospital in Kharkiv, the wounded continue to arrive as Ukrainian forces come under heavy fire. In Mariupol, the damage inflicted by Russian bombs is clear. Unfortunately, nothing remains of Mariupol, and they're bombing it with savage weapons. This last week, there have been explosions like I've never heard before. They hit residential areas with rockets. Hundreds continue to flee Mariupol, saying goodbye to their decimated city and to those who must stay behind.
I want to speak now to Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, currently joining me from Boston in the United States. A very warm welcome to the show. First, I want to ask you about Biden's remarks in Warsaw, Poland. Now, he said on Saturday that Russian President Vladimir Putin, quote, cannot remain in power. The White House already walking that back. Do you expect there to be consequences from this?
I think if they walk it back quickly, I'm not quite sure what consequences Putin can do about it. I mean, he's got his military almost fully deployed in Ukraine or close to it, so he can't go to war with NATO. If he'd go to war with NATO, he'd lose in a heartbeat. So in some ways, Putin has no way to retaliate against it that wouldn't backfire on him. The White House, as you say, is already walking it back. So my guess is this will not be a major issue relatively soon.
Okay, so with that cleared up, I want to ask you about the military situation. A high-ranking Russian military official said on Friday that Russia has completed the first stage of its operation and could now focus on what it calls its main goal, the liberation of Donbass. At the same time, we also heard from our correspondent today that there are explosions near Lviv in the west of the country. What is to be made of all this?
Well, those are not, by the way, naturally exclusive events. The attacks on Lviv would be going on if they have a limited war in the east, simply to try and slow down the movement of goods and supplies and reinforcements from western Ukraine to eastern Ukraine. Look, the move to an eastern Ukraine strategy is in some ways rational because the Russian military has been overextended. It's suffered serious losses. It hasn't been able to take any of its major objectives at this point. And it probably couldn't with the army it has now. It's hard to see how they would ever take Kiev with the force they have. So they can, in a sense, dial it down to say, okay, we never really meant to do this. What we want to do is take eastern Ukraine. And they militarily could do. They could take more of eastern Ukraine. The problem with that strategy is that how do you end the war? Unless Ukraine will accept that, then you end up, which I don't think they would at this point, then you end up in a permanent war with the crippling sanctions hitting Russia. So it's a militarily perhaps clever idea, but it's not quite clear how this ends the war.
Now, I just want to clarify. So in your view, a focus on eastern Ukraine, making that the priority in their strategy, does not then preclude attacks on western Ukraine?
No, not at all. I mean, one of the success stories for Ukraine during this war so far is that they've kept supplies flowing from west to east. They've had much better logistical operations than the Russians. So if the Russians are in a war in the east, they're still going to want to try and keep the Ukrainians from resupplying and reinforcing their armies because the fighting would be going on. So it wouldn't be an attack to take over Lviv. It's simply attack to destroy the infrastructure of Lviv to make a good supply. I mean, that would be a guess. We don't know at this point. I just don't want, it shouldn't be read that because they are attacking Lviv, they're not doing the Eastern strategy. That's not actually, as I said, exclusive.
Now, you've mentioned the potential for a long, drawn-out conflict in the East. Do you see this as Russia preparing for a war of attrition? And if so, does the Russian military have the resources to carry that out?
I think basically right now there's crisis in the Russian military and the Russian government. I'm not sure anyone is thinking long term, or right now they're simply trying to salvage what has been a strategic catastrophe for the Russian army. And I don't think we can sugarcoat it. The Russian army was unprepared for the war that it fought. The Ukrainians were prepared, and the Russians have been suffering throughout and around the line in Ukraine. So I'm not quite sure they're actually thinking in any kind of long-term structural way. They're trying now to simply save face. And that would be an Eastern Ukraine move would be to save face. But it's then how you end the war.
Now, it is difficult to get reliable numbers, but some sources, particularly in Ukraine, have suggested that Russians are suffering massive casualties. Estimates between 7,000 and 15,000 troops killed in action. Do you have a sense of how reliable those figures are?
Well, I think the 7,000 was one given out by the United States Department of Defense about a week ago, or even a little bit longer. So that was probably a relatively accurate figure at the time. So, I mean, 15,000 might be on the high end, but I think from 7,000 to 10,000 seems very possible within the range of activity we've had. And then you'd have a number of more times wounded. I mean, you can do some quite horrible metrics by just looking at the number of Russian vehicles destroyed, not the ones abandoned, but the ones destroyed. And they're well over, I think, 1,000 at this point that have been destroyed. And each one of them would have had, say, 2, 3, 4, sometimes more people in them, depending on what kind of vehicle they were. So whatever the number is, it's much, much higher than I think almost anyone thought going into this war, and certainly much higher than the Russians ever thought they would suffer.
Okay, on that note, we're going to leave the interview there. I want to thank Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, very much for joining us on DW News.
Thank you.